Good morning, folks. Instructor Gaynor here. We are continuing our discussions about normative ethical theories. We will be doing Immanuel Kant's Ethics, Part 1, that's found in the first chapter concerning Kant in your textbook. We'll be doing Part 2 next time, obviously. Now, in order to set the stage for talking about Kant's ethics, the author of the text gives us two specific scenarios to think about. One is a person who behaves as a tax cheat in order to save that money for himself, to take his family on a vacation. Another is a person who decides to cheat on an exam in order to do well. Now keep in mind, the people who do these things think that they are gaining something out of the bargain. And it is the view of many of us that they have done something wrong. Now, of course, the idea that they've done something wrong appeals to an idea that will be showing up throughout this chapter. They didn't play how. They didn't play fair. There are tax laws on the books that as members of a free society, like it or not, we do what to do. We do what, excuse me. Well, we are obligated, we have a duty to abide by those rules. Now, folks, keep in mind, if you take the viewpoint that you are somehow above those rules, what expectations, fairness-wise, ought you not to have? You ought not to have the expectation that anybody else should do so. Because to say that something is fair implies that they apply to everybody. Yeah. All people at all times, no ifs, and or buts. In other words, it's not about you and what you want for you. It's about a policy that applies to all people at the same time. No ifs, and or buts. The same way with cheating. Some people may think cheating on an exam or something is in their short-term best interest if they can get away with it, because they'll get a nicer score and so forth. However, they are cheating other people. They are not playing by the rules. Now, this is another issue, but I would argue that in the long run, they are not helping themselves anyway, even if they think that they are. And it has nothing to do with guilt, because I know plenty of people feel no guilt at all. Seriously. It is because in the end, even if you do get that piece of paper, you didn't really earn that piece of paper. And if you were expected to have learned something, you will not actually have learned those things. So in a way, when you cheat other people, you're technically also cheating yourself, even though it doesn't really look like that on the surface. More on that later. Now, the philosopher who will be talking about principles of fairness and consistency in relationship to his ethics is an Enlightenment era philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. You don't have to remember his lifespan, born 1724, died in 1804. A lot of his major works were done in the 1780s. He is a quintessential Enlightenment philosopher. And just for those of you who haven't had a history course, the Enlightenment is that period in Western civilization where reason would be determined to be the great light that human beings ought to shine upon things. Because using our reason, not only can we come to scientific understandings of reality, not only does reason bring out the best faculty that we have, it is what separates us from the so-called lower beasts. But one more thing. Remember when we were discussing Jeremy Bentham and this idea that he wanted to formulate morality as if it were a science? Guess what other philosopher will use that same kind of framing? Immanuel Kant. He will also attempt to formulate morality as if it were a science too, albeit he will come to very different conclusions about what defines moral worth than Bentham does. Now, some of the advantages of formulating morality as if it were a science is that we will see to it that A, morality is rational. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But to say that morality is rational is to imply that anybody, when they put their mind to it properly, can discover and understand the moral law. Because you're all what? Yeah, you're all people. You're all rational human beings. So it is possible for all human beings to understand the moral law. Now, the other side of, and this is implied in the chapter, is that conversation about being universal. If morality can indeed be formulated as a science, as Kant purports, then morality can be understood objectively. In other words, if you understand morality properly, you will understand that there is one moral law, and it applies to all people at all times, whether or not they are aware of it or not. Simply because you don't know the moral law doesn't mean that it's not there. If you allow your reason to work properly, you could discover the moral law. And we will be talking about his uncovering the moral law as we move forward. I just wanted to make sure before we got started fully that you understood that our human rational capabilities are front and center in our ability to derive the moral law, according to Kant. Now, the author talks about consistency and fairness. Now, before we get started here, consistency and fairness are in some sense related to one another. If something is fair, it means that it applies to all people and at all times. And to behave with consistency means something like what? To perpetually be acting or behaving in a particular way. That's what it means to be consistent. Now, in order to sort of get us started into at least a Kantian style of thinking, the author of the text gives us scenarios that we might consider doing. And it is when we ask ourselves this question, what if everybody did that? We're going in the direction of Kantian thinking. Although the author does contend that that question, what if everybody did that, isn't fully blown Kantian. The reason for this is because whenever I ask, what if everybody did that, I might not really be basing my decisions on the moral law. I might actually be calculating that if everybody behaved this way, that things wouldn't go very well for me or anybody else. And therefore, I might decide not to do it. Now, folks, that is not Kantian thinking. Because whenever you're doing a Kantian moral analysis, what are you supposed to divorce yourself of? You're supposed to divorce yourself of your egoism. Why? Because even if you were doing something that would be consistent with morality for egoistic reasons, Kant would say you would be doing something that conforms with what morality tells you to do, but you would be doing so with the wrong intentions. For Kant, the outcomes are not what define the moral worth of an action. It is the intentions of the actor, or agent, excuse me. I'm getting ahead of myself a tiny little bit, because it's difficult not to when you're talking about this. Now, for Kant, the only moral motive, according to him, is to act out of the rational intention to follow the moral law. And he refers to that moral intention as the goodwill. For those of you who've read ahead, you've seen this before. He calls that rational desire to obey the moral law within. He calls that a goodwill. And he says the only thing that is inherently good in and of itself is this thing that he calls the goodwill. The goodwill is supposed to be divorced of self-interested motives, as well as divorced from what is sometimes called fellow feeling, compassion, concern. As a matter of fact, the moral law ought to be done out of the purely rational motive to follow the moral law. Because Kant understood that the emotions, even though they might motivate some people to do things in conformity with morality, the emotions actually get in the way of actual morality. Why? And you've seen this before in other chapters. Because instead of fairness, our emotions lead us to partiality. And according to Immanuel Kant's analysis, our partiality always reduces back to what? Always reduces back to egoism. In other words, if I help someone out with the intention that I don't want to see that person suffer, Kant would ask the question, well, why don't you want to see them suffer? Is it because you would feel bad or feel guilt doing it? Well, brother, it might be the right thing to help that person out, but your intentions might be non-moral. I didn't say immoral. I said non-moral. Because as long as your self-interest is among those motives, you have negated the actual moral worth of your actions. Because for Kant, your actions ought to be truly altruistic in order to count as having moral worth. In other words, you're supposed to divorce yourself of anything that might reduce back to egoism. Now, I hope I'm reiterating here why we talked about psychological egoism early in the course. Because philosophers have taken the possibility of egoism very seriously. And they have also taken it very seriously that psychological egoism is all that we can be motivated by. That it would be a serious hindrance to the possibility of meaningful moral worth of any of our actions. However, Kant did believe that we could overcome this egoism. And I will be talking about this more in this lecture and the next one. Now, the author of the text also mentions our good friend, the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Please do not foul this up on a future quiz or examination. Kant's moral rule will not be the same as the golden rule, even though they will tend to counsel the same sort of actions. Because the golden rule says do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Does anyone know why Kant would not count this as a truly moral law? Because if you're thinking in the back of your mind, as I would have them do unto me, you are actually ultimately thinking about how you would feel if it happened to you. And you're letting your emotions get involved. In other words, it could be reduced to self-interested. Well, why don't I lie to other people? Because it blows chunks to be lied to. It feels bad to be lied to. Therefore, I'm not going to lie. Well, Kant would say that is in conformity with what morality would tell you to do. Don't lie. But the motivation is not truly an altruistic one in accordance with the moral law. Have I made that pretty clear? This is why, according to Kant, what the golden rule basically tells us how to act in conformity with what morality would be. It is not truly a moral law, because self-interestedness is allowed to seep into the picture. You're supposed to be completely devoid of self-interest when you're making your moral calculations. Now, a couple more things. Universalizability. Now, the author of the text frames it this way. A principle is only moral if and only if its maxim is universalizable. Yeah, it's a pain in the butt to say universalizable. Don't worry, you won't have to say it often. If a principle is universalizable, it means that it applies to all people, all times, all circumstances, no ifs, and, or buts. Now, I want to talk briefly about this word. Kant uses it. Folks, in our everyday lingo, when we think of a maxim, you probably think about something like a wise saying or a piece of wisdom. Now, whenever Kant uses the word maxim, he means something a little bit different. A maxim is a rule of conduct that you give to yourself. A maxim is a rule of conduct that you give to yourself. Now, the reason why this phrase that you give to yourself is so important is because as an Enlightenment philosopher, Kant places what front and center in morality? He places the individual front and center. Because if you are consciously going to recognize and agree to the moral law, then it is something that you as a rational human being must recognize. In other words, you shouldn't be doing it out of the tutelage of somebody else. You know, the Ten Commandments told me to. Or, because my daddy said he would beat my butt if I didn't do it. In other words, any other motivation for doing something would be doing it under what? Would be doing it under the threat of coercion of one sort or another. Now keep in mind, if I am doing something in conformity with morality because I want to get a gold star for it, that is a form of coercion too. That's something we call positive reinforcement in behavioral lingo. If I am merely following the moral law because I want to get praise for it, then I might be doing something in conformity with what morality would dictate. But my motive would not truly be moral. Because guess what it would come right back down to? Yeah, egoism would come right back down to self-interest. Now we're going to have to break for now because we don't have too much time. We will be talking more about rationality moving forward, and we will be distinguishing between what Kant calls the categorical imperative and hypothetical imperatives. And as a side note, he will frame the moral law as imperatives. An imperative is a command. But keep in mind, it's not a command that somebody else gives to you. It is a command that you give to yourself freely and rationally. Because through the clear light of reason, you understand the moral law, and you understand that you ought to follow it. More on that shortly. Cheers.